Hello and welcome, boys and girls. This is part 4 to our stories about fairies and elves called Land Behind Enchantment's Veil. Part 4. Clothed in the stranger's skin, Pwyll rode forward into Annwn, looking about him with great curiosity. The path wound through green fields laced by shining streams. At its end lay a castle with many turrets. Their roof tiles glinted in the sunshine, their pennants snapping in the breeze. The castle gates were open, and as Pwyll entered, grooms came to draw off his boots and take his horse. Gold-clad knights, young and merry, clustered around him, chattering about the hunt as they walked into the hall. And Pwyll saw that Arryn was beloved in his own world. In the hall, fires crackled, and long tables were laid for feasting. Arryn's wife awaited Pwyll there. The king had not lied. She was the loveliest lady Pwyll had ever seen. Her hair shone gold in the firelight, and her flesh was so translucent that when she drank wine from his cup, Pwyll imagined he could see the red liquid flowing down her throat. All during the evening of feasting she stayed by Pwyll's side, talking affectionately and smiling up at him. It was clear that Arryn's lady loved her husband, and Pwyll answered in kind. But when the courtiers at last withdrew and the couple went together to the bedchamber, Pwyll lay in bed with his face to the wall, and made no sound or move, even when the lady curled against him. Although he was clothed in another man's skin, he would not take that man's wife. Matters continued thus for the appointed year. Each day was spent in hunting and feasting, and making merry with the Queen of Annwn, and each night Pwyll turned his body to the wall beside the bed, and spoke not a word. At the end of the year, Pwyll armed himself and went forth to do battle with Havgan. Arryn's knights rode with him to the place, which was a ford that bridged a stream, separating the two fairy territories. Across the stream waded Havgan, a heavy, pale-eyed man surrounded by his followers. When Havgan saw his enemy, he raised the lance he bore and cried, "All who hear, listen well. This is single combat between two kings who decide who rules these lands. Let none but us meet in battle." His followers and Annwn drew back, and the two kings wheeled their chargers into position. Then Havgan nodded and lowered his lance, and the warriors charged directly at each other, meeting with a mighty crash at the center of the ford. Havgan cried out, and shouts rose from the stream banks. Pwyll's lance had struck the boss of his foe's shield, splitting it and piercing the enemy's armor. The fairy king slumped forward on his horse's neck, then fell, his life blood staining the waters of the ford. The light began to dwindle in his eyes as he regarded the man in Arryn's place. At that moment, he seemed to recognize Pwyll through the veil of Arryn's flesh. "I had no quarrel with you," he said. "Since you have begun the kill, however, finish my pain and give me death." But Pwyll heeded Arryn's final words. "Let him who wishes strike another blow," he replied, "for I will not do it." Then Havgan cried to his men, "I can no longer maintain you." The blood ran red from his mouth, and he died in the shallow waters of the ford. Pwyll looked across the falling king to the warriors on the opposite bank and said, "Decide among yourselves now, who will follow me and end this struggle?" And one by one Havgan's warriors came to him and did him homage. Thus the fairy kingdoms were united under Arryn's rule by Pwyll. The next day the mortal left the palace and the lady behind, and rode along to the clearing, as he and Aaron had agreed. The fairy king in the mortal's shape was there before him. "I have ruled your lands in Dyfed well," he said. "I have cleansed the stain of my honor," Pwyll replied. The two crossed the clearing and saluted each other. Then each rode toward his own lands, and as they passed the verges of the clearing, each returned to his own flesh. When Aaron reached his palace, his household greeted him as always, for they had never been aware of his absence. But his lady, though she bantered with him gaily as she always had, and drank wine from his cup, seemed withdrawn. After the revelries, Aaron went to their chamber. He drew her into his arms at once, for he had missed her sorely. But she stiffened and turned her head away in silence. "What is this?" said Aaron. "Why do you caress me now, when for a year you would not touch me?" she said with sadness. "Of course I have touched you," answered Aaron the king. She shook her head. Aaron was silent, pondering the fidelity of the mortal who had taken his place. At last he said gently, "Forgive me, lady, but I have been far from you for this past year." And he told her all that had happened. When he had done so, the lady said, "That was a faithful friend you had, who denied himself for you." "So I think," Aaron replied. "And well you might," his lady said, but she laughed as she spoke, and all was well. That was how a fairy and a mortal became faithful friends for all their lives. They hunted together in the mortal world and in Annwn. They sent each other gifts of hawks and hounds and horses. When Pwyll's valor became known, he often was called head of Annwn, rather than prince of Dyfed, and he found a fairy wife of his own, whose name was Rhiannon. Such bridging friendships and easy traffic between the mortal and the fairy realms were rare, even in the world's young age, and they would become rarer still as the centuries wore away. As the realm of humankind expanded and that of nature receded, fairy receded as well, to become something rich and strange that was glimpsed only on infrequent occasions or from far away. It would happen, say, that a sailor would glance idly over his ship's side and see, as in a rock pool, mountains mantled with tall trees and crowned by turreted palaces. In the green depths he might spy shepherds tending their flocks, or horsemen riding to the hunt. His ship's shadow would cross the landscape as cloud shadows cross earthly fields and hills, and the creatures below would turn curious faces up to look, and perhaps they would meet his gaze. Off the coast of Scotland, it was said there was such a kingdom, sometimes called Lochlin, and sometimes Sorcha. The Scots said that the children of this king were seals or selkies when in the sea, and human when they came on land. Their fate was always to be lonely. They could not be content in either place, because it is given to them that their sea longing shall be land longing, and their land longing shall be sea longing. On the wild western coasts of Ireland and Norway, people who paused to observe the crimson path of the setting sun might see misty islands rising from the waves. They knew these belonged to fairy, for they could see the sun make fiery lights on the windows of the castles there. But the islands always disappeared into the sea again. The Irish called them the Isle of the Blessed, and gave them many names. Tirna Nuag, or the land of the young, was one. Tirn Ail, or the other world, was another. Off the Welsh coast was Ynys Gwydryn, or the Island of Glass, so called because the palaces there were made of glass and shone like crystal. And on the land, fairy kingdoms were hidden in grassy mounds that on All Hallows Eve might open, or even rise into the air on pillars to reveal the glittering palaces within. The mounds existed both in Ireland and in Scotland. If these elusive places could be reached, a wistful traveler remarked, they would be proved to be filled with luminous intensity, their sun more golden and moon more silver than those of the mortal world, their flowers more fragrant and their fruit more sweet. Everything in fairy is better by this one wonderful degree, he said, and it is by this betterness that you will know that you are there. It was no wonder that some adventurers among the world's youth forsook their own realm and chose to stay within the boundaries of fairy. A man named Lo Gair, the son of a king of Connacht, did that. Lo Gair had fought in battle beside a fairy king named Fiachna, and loved that king's country so well that he severed every human tie to stay within it, thereby breaking his own father's heart. Another such adventurer was the Irish chieftain O'Donoghue, a warrior so valiant that even the Tuatha sang his praises. O'Donoghue left his stronghold one May day morning and walked into the waters of Lake Killarney. He sank into the lake and never was seen alive again. Each May Day morning for centuries after, however, O'Donoghue visited his earthly home. Just as the sun touched Mount Glenna near the lake, the waters would begin to churn, and in a shower of glittering spray, O'Donoghue, riding a white charger, would burst through the surface. Trailing behind him were crowds of youths and maidens who danced to the music of silver bells and followed the chieftain across the water, disappearing with him in the mists around the lake. The time was coming, however, when mortals who crossed the border into fairy, if they could cross at all, had no choice about returning. They were lost to their own world and their own kind forever, unless another mortal rescued them, which sometimes happened. The borders between the worlds would begin to close, and mortals would no longer be able to touch fairy gold or eat fairy food in safety. They would long for fairy lovers and sometimes take them, but those loves would be the source of endless sorrow. It was said, too, that as the centuries passed, the Tuatha and their kind dwindled in size. When they were glimpsed riding in procession or dancing in the night, they were not tall kings and queens, but creatures no bigger than the length of a man's hand, and no louder than a chorus of insects twittering in the grass. The women were perfect in figure and feature and resplendent in gowns of gauze and gold. As for the tiny knights, they were cunningly fashioned armor that glittered like faceted gems. The air all around them twinkled with fairy lights, and it was deliciously clean and sweet, charged with a wild scent that lingered long after they disappeared. It was said that eventually the princes of fairyland became smaller still, so small that they rode saddled grasshoppers instead of horses, and sported armor made of fish scales. They lived no longer beneath hill and sea, but in the hollows of oak trees, or in the cowslip's bell, or under the leaves of alder and birch. The heroic fairies thus gradually disappeared as a separate species. They were absorbed into the teeming population of earth fairies, and had thronged forest and field and stream and lake ever since the world was shaped. The end. Thank you guys for staying and listening to this amazing story about fairies and elves. I hope you had a good time. I want you to know I care about you. I'm thinking about you. Now go out and do something great today. Thanks so much.